I want to go to a different issue, but that also kind of lies at transparency versus security. And that's an issue that's gotten a fair amount of attention in recent months, which is the request that we've been getting to disclose the identities of people who violate the SIP standards. I mean, as the Commission's currently processing FOIA requests for the identity of every SIP violator since the monthly filings began in 2010, and well over 200 individually processed FOIA requests. The approach that NERC has taken since the very beginning, which is to file SIP violators as undisclosed registered entity, was largely unchallenged for many years and really unexamined as far as I know, but it's being squarely asked about now. Just to note, there seems to be an urban legend in the Twitterverse that this is something I invented, which is definitely not true. It was happening before I got to the Commission, but it's definitely in the spotlight right now. We've never really had a public process to have a discussion or a consideration of what the right balance is between transparency, so we can learn from what happened, and the state regulators and others who follow this have a interest in knowing what's happening, but of course protection of grid security, and how the monthly filings or how the filings on penalties might be adapted to better balance those concerns. I mean, I think there's very important considerations on both sides. We have to scrupulously avoid disclosing critical electric infrastructure information and follow the FAST Act and our own regs. But we have to be careful that we're not overprotecting information that might have more reputational harm than security harm. And there's a legitimate interest in transparency. So I'd like to, I think there'd be real value in having some kind of public process to discuss this. And I'm curious if anyone on the panel would like to comment either on the issue, which seems to be hot right now, or how we get our hands around it. Jennifer.
So, as you know, this issue is very important to EEI's members, and in fact to all registered entities. It's not a secret that the industry had its struggles in the early days of the SIP standards, and that most utilities probably do have a settlement agreement on file with FERC. That said, we do have to balance. I agree with your comments. There has to be a balance between transparency and protecting critical information that could be used by intelligent adversaries to sort of back engineer their way into exploiting vulnerabilities.
Especially if it hasn't been mitigated yet, but
Well, and
hopefully
even-
most of them have. Yeah.
Well, probably most of them have, and I don't disagree with you on that, but some of the settlement agreements that were filed early on contain a lot of information about exactly how the issues were mitigated. And so if you have an information about how an issue was mitigated, then you have information on how a new vulnerability might be exploited. So there has to be a balance. We support the process that that FERC has embarked upon now. It's tedious. We certainly recognize that, but we think the case-by-case examination of the particular agreements in question are helpful and useful, and I thank your staff because I know it's a lot of work.
Anyone else?
I just didn't make an observation here. I think this is there is a lot of froth around this issue right now with some of the recent name disclosures, and I think it's appropriate. And I would encourage the Commission to have a very thoughtful and deliberative process in determining how it would like to proceed in this area. I think it's really important to understand the differences between SIP violations, mitigated or not, and O&P violations. O&P violations are the result of random events that occur out on the system that may or may not have been well protected against or won't be well protected against. In the SIP area, we're dealing with determined adversaries. And while I think we obviously have a core principle in our country of transparency and desire for that, and I think that's a very valuable characteristic of a democracy. At the same point in time, we don't want to be laying out blueprints, for how entities can be attacked, particularly in such a critical sector. So I think mitigated or unmitigated, there's a lot of sensitivity around this issue. And I would absolutely encourage the Commission to have a thoughtful, deliberative process and a public process around how to handle this, because I don't think it's not a simple problem, simple issue to resolve.
I agree with what's been said. I just, from personal experience working with some of our industry partners that have had some significant violations, even after the mitigation has taken place. They're still in a recovery period. So I still worry about these companies. The work doesn't end for me when we sign the settlement agreement, sign off on the mitigation. There's a sustainability issue. And my concern with releasing the names too soon, I do support transparency, by the way, but releasing the names too soon, it's sort of like there's a weakened animal in the herd, and that's where all the lions are going to go. And I just think we need to be extremely careful with that because mitigation itself, there's still a recovery period associated with it. Because a lot of the issues we run into are not technological, they are cultural, organizational, and those sometimes take longer to correct. And there are little fall downs along the way.
Well, I'll just briefly say I agree. The issue needs more discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I actually just wanted to pick up where Commissioner LaFleur left off, because it is a very important issue, and it's not an easy issue. It's as complicated as everyone has mentioned. But transparency is a very important goal, but I want to talk more about deterrence, right? Because I think one of the issues is, we certainly want people to know what who's being penalized and so on, maybe if there's not any issues with regard to security. But at the same time, we also want to deter companies from not following, or we want to encourage companies and send companies to follow SIP requirements and so on. And so this goes back to, first year law school when you learn about why people get, penalized, or so why in criminal law, why people get sent to jail. And sometimes people get sent to jail because it's justice. Sometimes we do it to deter future action or prevent recidivism. And so my concern is that to the extent companies are penalized, but we don't name the names, that they're not sufficiently incented not to disregard the rules. We're not sometimes disregard, sometimes just not follow the rules sufficiently the next time. And so I wanted to ask Mr. Robb, maybe if you could, and I know it's a tough issue, and again, but is there a way maybe we could design something where we list the companies that are penalized, but don't necessarily connect those companies that are penalized with the actual issues associated with not following the SIP requirements, so that people actually, there's not a security issue?
I'm sure there's a path through this, right, that people could get aligned around. I think my view is that I just think it needs to be clear and transparent so that everybody kind of understands the rules of the game. The one point I would make, though, that I think is important, and it builds on something that Tim said that I think is really, really important. We can't fine a company enough relative to the risk that they have from a cyber event, right? And I think management and executives understand that. The issue that we have to make sure that we're doing throughout all of our work, and enforcement is part of the puzzle here, is that the top management has attention to the issues in play. If you go back to the work that Tim and a couple of the other regions did around the root causes of major SIP violations, the vast majority of these are not related to having the wrong widget or something like that. They're embedded in management structure, approach, philosophy, all that kind of stuff. So really what we need to be doing is making sure that all of our actions around SIP compliance, right, is all geared around changing management behavior, right, as opposed to penalizing. The penalty is part of that, but it's not the only part of it. So I think that's an important piece to keep in mind.
Wouldn't you agree that part of the incentive for SIP compliance should get management to follow, to ensure that the proper approach is that SIP requirements are complied with, is that they don't want to be embarrassed that they were fined?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Switching subjects, I was really intrigued, Mr. Brown, by your suggestion about the fuel supply chain, and maybe that we should consider that as part of the bulk power system. I was curious if you had any further thoughts about how we might go about doing that.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to comment on that last question. I've worked with a number of boards in my career, and the focus of every one of those boards on audits of any kind has been extremely sharp, whether it's a financial audit, whether it's a controls audit, whether it's a NERC audit. I don't see any more focus from my particular board on NERC compliance because of the threat of a penalty. I just don't. And I think boards that are properly structured and are properly functioning would be in that same boat. I don't disagree that penalties are necessary when boards aren't that focused. But to me, that's a small percentage of our industry that applies to, not the vast majority. So on to the fuel supply. I began my career as a planning engineer. And I guarantee in the N-1 evaluations to comply with NERC criteria that I constantly focused on fuel and the lack thereof for the various plants. In our part of the country, it's interesting with respect to gas because unlike on the East Coast and the West Coast, our gas pipeline system is a network almost. Many of our gas plants have 2 and sometimes 3 different pipeline options for operation. And so we've been blessed by that from a reliability perspective, but I still am a firm believer that fuel is part of the mix. I mean, the plant's useless without fuel. I mean, you can look at a forced outage rate all day long. But fuel has got to be considered as part of that, in my view.